I'd like to introduce Steve Jamieson. He's going to give us a talk entitled A Brief History of British Computing. When I first started organizing the event about 6 months ago, Steve was the first person to come up and say, "Hey, I'd like to be a presenter." And I said, "Thank you very, very much," because I was desperate at the time. Since then, having seen your presentation, and it's a large one, good, but large. I'm pleased with the way it's turned out, and Steve is now going to entertain me for the next hour. Steve, thanks.
Okay, thanks everybody for coming today to my presentation. As Michael explained, it's going to be a brief history. There's an awful lot of it, so I'm going to move very fast. And please hold any questions to the end. So, okay, we're going to start off with this guy, Charles Babbage, going back all the way to the 1800s. And he was a mathematician. And he dabbled in all sorts of things, insurance, post office. And he was actually the Lucasian professor of maths at Cambridge, which means he was in the same company as Isaac Newton before him and Stephen Hawking after him, so he was the art guy. And in the middle of this, he decided to invent this difference engine, which was basically a giant calculator. It wasn't quite a computer, but he had all these tables to produce for all these insurance and post office things he was doing. So he invented this difference engine, which he tried to get built, but it never managed to get completed because he was having problems with his builder and things like that. And then he got a little bit distracted because while he was still building the difference engine, he decided this could go even further. And he said, well, I could actually make this other things. And he decided to build the analytical engine, which is more computer-like. And that was going to use punch card controls like the old Jacquard looms they had. It was a completely mechanical device. It was built to decimal. And it had some of the elements that modern computers have, like an arithmetic unit, which they call middle, and they actually had, possible to do loops and branching, so technically it was a Turing complete computer. And in fact, although he didn't get much of it built, there were some prototype pieces built, and in 1910, his son actually built a piece of the mill and demonstrated it so that it could be proved to be working. And also, Ada Lovelace, who was the daughter of Lord Byron, was involved, and I'll come to that in a second, so let's move on. So there's the difference engine on the left is the one in the Science Museum. That's actually not a replica, that's the difference engine, right? Because they built the first one in 1991, right? They never built it back in 1847. And they actually built two, and one of them was owned by Nathan Merville, who you may know about. He was head of research at Microsoft, and I believe that's down in the Computer History Museum in California.
No, it's not. Nathan Merville has it his own place.
Oh, okay. Well, it moves around, I think. The one on the right is an actual piece of the analytical engine, a trial model for a piece of it. These are both in the Science Museum. I should point out that the scale's not the same there. The one on the left is like 6 foot high, and the one on the right is about 3 foot high, so they're quite different there. So this is Lady Ada Lovelace, who was the daughter of Lord Byron, and she was actually a mathematician, which in those days was kind of a bit unusual for women, but they thought there was a sort of this rumor that madness was running in the family, so she got trained in mathematics to try and prevent that. And she translated this paper by an Italian mathematician about the analytical engine. And she got very interested and actually tried to develop some programs for it, even though there was no actual hardware to run those programs on. And this is an actual piece of that. Those are her actual notes for programming on this analytical engine. And I don't know if you can read the top there. It says, a diagram for the computation by the engine of the numbers of Bernoulli. It certainly looks like a program to me. So, okay, so let's move on. The next interesting person from way back when is George Boole, who you may have heard about again. He was a self-taught mathematician, and he spent most of his life as a school teacher. So he wasn't trained in universities, didn't go to Cambridge, anything like that. But he used to put out he was a very gifted mathematician, and he put these papers out, and eventually won this gold prize for his paper from the Royal Society. So he was very well thought of, and he started to communicate with other mathematicians of the day. And then he was so good that they decided to make him professor of maths at Queen's College in Cork. And then he published his sort of major work, The Laws of Thought, which was in 1854, piece of down there, which introduced basic Boolean logic. And if you look at it, you won't see, NAND and NOR gates, but you will see the AND and ORs and all that kind of stuff that you may have learned, in school. And as far as I know, he's the only guy to actually have data type named after him. So there you go. What else? The interesting thing I thought about this was that he didn't write a book on maths. He wrote a book on the laws of thought. So he was thinking about how people think, which is really quite amazing. Really. Yeah, very, very, very ambitious guy. So next I'm going to move on to the early days, but first I need to do a few translations so that you can follow me. Over here you have a vacuum tube. Over in England we have a valve, so that thing is called a valve. Over here you have Rube Goldberg, and strangely enough we have a sort of parallel evolution guy called Heath Robinson who does the same little kind of cartoons. Why that's relevant, I'll come in a minute. Things like the mains power are different in England, right? So we have 240 volts. The TV system is different, and why that's important will come on later. And also, for example, you have, back in the day there was, you had cable over here, but cable never caught on in England. So we only had the BBC, which was a quasi-governmental organization for broadcasting, and because of that, it had a very high importance in the society, right? Much more important than, a TV station over here, because we only had like one or two, so it was really important. And then over here you have AT&T, which is a private company, and you have post office mail, but we have the GPO, or General Post Office, or at least we did back in the day, which used to do mail and phone. And again, it's kind of a quasi-government organization, and they had a lock on all things phone, which kind of had an effect on the way communications was developed. And I'm going to say ZAT, not ZAT. And the other thing is to know that when I say GCHQ, that stands for Government Communication Headquarters, which is kind of the equivalent of the NSA over here. Okay. So next, Alan Turing and Bletchley Park. So in 1930s, you may have seen the movie The Imitation Game, which explains a lot of what Alan Turing was up to in Bletchley Park, although there's a lot of artistic license in that, to say the least. So in 1936, Alan Turing, who was a mathematician, went to Cambridge. He was working on this thing called the decision problem, which a German mathematician had put forward. And in solving that, he produced this idea of having a universal computer. And then he went to Princeton, actually, to do his PhD. So he did his PhD in the USA. And he met and worked with John von Neumann while he was there. So obviously they probably exchanged a lot of ideas. So in 1939, he ended up at Bletchley Park, which is where the things like the movie come in. And he worked on decoding the Enigma machine. And I noticed they have an Enigma machine right here in the museum on the way in, so we can take a look at that. And then moving on, he worked mostly on the bomb, but at that point they discovered there was another machine called the Lorenz machine, which had a much more complicated encryption scheme. They knew they needed a more powerful machine to decode it, and they started doing this proof of concept for how they could do it, and they invented this little machine called Heath Robinson. That was basically to prove, whether they could use valves in a machine to get the thing working. And then later on, they moved on to Colossus, which once they proved that Heath Robinson was working, they moved on to the Colossus Mark I, which had 1,600 valves, and then they produced the Colossus Mark II, which had 2,400 valves. And the guy who built that was a guy called Tommy Flowers, who worked for the post office in England. And the reason he used to, in the post office, he worked with valves a lot. And when he first proposed the idea of valves, they said, no, they're too unreliable, we can't use them. So his secret was, he said, well, just don't turn them off. He said, if you don't turn them off, they're a lot more reliable and we can actually use them. And so about 10 Colossuses were built, and it's really, it's not a completely general purpose computer, but it is kind of a fixed program computer to decode the Lorenz traffic. And most of these things were all dismantled and hidden after the war, hidden in GCHQ, and were top secret until the mid-1980s. So, so, a little bit more about Turing's paper. So, this, I'm not even going to try and pronounce that, but this is the paper he produced in 1936, which basically outlined the concept of a computer. The way I look at it is this, that algorithms have been around for a long time. Right? They were known to mathematicians long before computers were invented. And so mathematicians used to pose little problems, like how can we prove things about algorithms? And one of them was this decision problem that a German mathematician, David Hilbert, put forward, saying, will these algorithms ever end? And so what Turing had to do was he had to invent the concept of a computer that actually ran algorithms so that he could reason about algorithms. And that's how he got to using the concept of the computer in the paper. So here's a quick picture of the Enigma machine. This is one in Bletchley Park. And this is the replica of the bomb, which was used to decode the Enigma. Now, there are no actual bombs left. They're all dismantled and lost. Right? So this is a replica that was built. So the other thing I should say about bombs is there was actually a lot of them built, and there was about 200 of them built, and most of them were not actually at Bletchley Park. They were all scattered around the country. And the other thing that's not well known is that the US Army and the US Navy had a whole load of bombs as well. They built a lot of them over here. And they were faster than the British bombs, and I'm not quite sure what they were used for exactly. But and the other thing I should say about the bombs, it was not a British invention, it was actually a Polish invention that the British picked up and enhanced, right? So, right, this is the Lorenz cipher machine, and the Heath Robinson machine that was sort of the prototype for the Colossus machine. These are both in Bletchley Park. This is the replica of the Colossus that they have in Bletchley Park, and up on the top right there, that's Tommy Flowers, the GPO engineer who basically put this thing together. He didn't design it, it was designed by the mathematicians at Bletchley, but he's the guy who actually made it happen. One interesting thing to note about this is it's very similar to, it was built with telephone switches equipment, right? So those are basically telephone racks and telephone equipment, the Colossus. And that's probably why they could build a replica, because they had a lot of that stuff around. Before we move on to more modern stuff or post-war stuff, let's have a quick think about what was going on just after the war there. So after the war, there were a lot of people coming off government projects, most of who worked on radar and things like that. And there was a lot of raw surplus equipment that could be repurposed. And there was also this race to build the computer, right, for Britain. They didn't think of it as building a computer. They thought, we're going to build the computer, because they thought Britain would only need one computer, right? So several groups started to work on building the computer for Britain. And the other thing to think about is what was driving all this computer activity, because you'll see there was an awful lot of it. And a lot of it was due to the Cold War and the race for the British nuclear bomb after World War II. The British didn't have the nuclear bomb, but they were desperate to get it. And also, there was the commercialization of nuclear power. There was a lot of innovation in aviation, jet engines being invented. People were trying to break the sound barrier. The British were churning out V-bombers to go, for the Cold War. And all this stuff needed a lot of intensive computer power. I think this is what drove a lot of the computer development in the early days. So this is one of the first ones. This is the Cambridge EDSAC at the University of Cambridge. And this was built by a guy called Morris V. Wilkes. It had 3,000 valves, used mercury delay lines. And it's pioneering because it's one of the first machines that used mnemonics and assembler mnemonics instead of just numbers for programming things. And it was partially funded by a company called Lions, who we'll talk about in a little bit more in a minute. And it was inspired by the USA EDVAC computer, actually, because Morris Wilkes had been to the States and he'd spoken to the EDVAC developers. And I think von Neumann put out a very famous paper on the EDVAC as well, which everybody read. So they were inspired by that. And then in 1951, Wilkes moves on and decides he's been designing this EDSAC, and he figures out that there's a better way to design the control section of computers, which is called microprogram control, which he invented. And then he used that to develop the EDSAC-2, which was the follow-on, which is a microprogram machine. And there's actually a replica of this at the National Museum of Computing in Bletchley Park. Again, look at it. It's like a rapid telephone equipment, right? It's rats and racks and racks, valves in it. So here's Morris V. Wilkes. He's the guy who invented microprogramming and, to some extent, bit slicing. And this is his paper that he wrote. Basically, microprogramming is a way to break down a computer's instructions into smaller steps called microinstructions. And this was used by most of the mainframes that, once this got out, most of the mainframes at the time used this, the IBM 360, 370, most of the minis, PDP-11, VAXes, Data General, and most of the 16-bit microprocessors when they came out with microprogramming. But not, interestingly enough, the 8-bit machines, they were not microprogrammed, they were much simpler. And unfortunately, this whole microprogramming thing got kind of out of hand, and people got a little bit carried away with it, and that was why there was a backlash, and the RISC machines came on a little bit later. So Leo computers, this was an interesting thing, because Leo computers were actually a giant, Leo Lions was a food company, right? They were a giant food company, they had these tea shops all over England, but they were a very advanced kind of business. I think they were a little bit like an early version of Starbucks, right? They sort of had a reliable product in every town you could go to, and but they didn't have free Wi-Fi as far as I know. So in 1951, they got very interested, and they thought they could use a computer for business, and so they funded the EDSAC development, and then they produced a variant of the EDSAC called Leo, which had 6,000 valves, mercury delay lines, and used about 30 kilowatts. And it was the first computer that was specifically intended to be for business purposes, but they did run other things on it. They had people come in, and they had so much interest that they actually set up a company. Because they were a food company. They set up a computer company called Leo, which stood for Lions Electronic Office, and they started to produce them. And so the Leo 2 was the commercial version of this. Leo 1s were just used for their own purposes, and Leo 2s they sold them to other companies. And then they moved on and produced more versions of the Leo. That some were the Leo 3, I think, was the first transistorized version. Of course, we're up in 1961 there. And then Leo got folded into English Electric. There was a lot of merging of companies, as you'll see. Leo got folded into English Electric, which got folded into ICT, which eventually ended up ICL. So here's a few pictures of the Leos. There's a Leo up on the top left. Again, very like the EDSAC telephone racks. There's the console down below left. And then there's this kind of advert for what the Lions actually did. Leo Computers factory up in the right-hand side, and the commercial Leo 2 at the bottom right. So one of the other interesting machines was the National Physical Laboratory Pilat ACE. And this was where Alan Turing ended up. Right? He had some designs after the war for computing machines. And in fact, he produced a whole pile of designs. And I think it was the 5th design they eventually decided to build. But it was a pretty complicated machine for its day. It was kind of a little bit advanced, and it really didn't owe anything to other kinds of machines. So it took a while to get that one built, and they got it. What they decided to do was the full ACE is too complicated, so we'll build a pilot machine. And in 1950, that machine built its first program, and it had 1,450 valves, mercury delay lines, but it was fast. It worked at 1 megahertz, which for those days is very quick. One interesting thing is this guy called Donald Davies worked on the Pilat ACE, and he ended up in one of the co-inventors of packet switching in 1965. So after the Pilat ACE went on, and they built a version of it called Mosaic, which was installed in the Telecoms Research Establishment, which is where they did radar and things like that. And that was mostly for defense and military, and that was a really big machine. It had 6,000 valves, a lot more than the Pilat ACE. But they also had solid-state diodes and things like that. And then English Electric picked up this ACE and decided to productize it, and they produced 33 of them. So that was quite a lot in those days. And then in 1957, the full ACE was completed. Here's a few pictures of the ACE, and the one on the left is a picture from when the thing was built in the 50s. And actually, the ones on the right there, the actual Pilat ACE in the Science Museum in London. It's not working, but it's the same. It's the actual one. It's the only built one of the Pilat ACEs, and it's on wheels, which I think was kind of interesting. So you can wheel it around. Okay, the other very important place was the University of Manchester, and in 1948 they produced the Manchester Baby, which was basically a proof of concept for this thing called the Williams-Kilburn tube, which was basically a CRT tube that they were using as RAM. It stored like 512 bits, I think, or something like that, which is ridiculously small today, but for those days it was actually quite impressive. And what they did is just draw the dots on the CRT tube and then had a mechanism to read them back. And it was the persistence of the phosphor that gave them the memory. And they had to keep refreshing it, so it was kind of a dynamic RAM, I guess. And it was done by two guys called Tom Kilburn and Freddie Williams. That's the Williams-Kilburn tube. And it was a follow-up from radar work they'd done during World War II. Then at Manchester, they went on to produce the Ferranti Mark I, which is sort of, after they did a proof of concept for the Baby, they did the Manchester Mark I, which ended up as the Ferranti Mark I. And then they did a transistor computer in 1953, but it wasn't a completely transistorized computer, which is why it doesn't get the prize for the first transistor computer. And then in 1954, they produced a machine called the Megacycle machine, which ended up as the Ferranti Mercury. 1955, they did another version of their transistor computer. And in 1962, they did a thing called the Muse, which ended up becoming the Ferranti Atlas, which we'll talk about in a little bit. The other thing I should mention is germanium transistors in those days were actually more expensive than valves, right? But they were less reliable, but they were less powerful. They used less power. So then Manchester went on to do the MU5, Manchester University 5, which influenced the ICL 2900, which we'll talk about later, and the MU6. So they had a long history. And Tom Kilburn was the guy behind that. And it's interesting, I think it's nice that they actually named the building after him at Manchester University for his computing department. So here's a picture of Tom Kilburn and Freddie Williams and with the baby. That's an actual contemporary picture of the baby up on the top right. That's his Williams-Kilburn tube down there. And that's a replica of the baby that they've actually built at the Museum of Science in Manchester. And it's actually a working replica that they built fairly recently. And the interesting thing is Tom Kilburn went on to be the professor of computing in Manchester and went on to build these other machines. But Freddie Williams never worked on another computer after the baby. That was it. He was done with computers. So Ferranti were very closely associated with Manchester. They commercialized a lot of the Manchester designs. And they built the Manchester Ferranti Mark I, which is a commercial version of the Manchester Mark I. And that on the right is an actual door from the Manchester Mark I. They built the Ferranti Pegasus, which is a much nicer machine, and sold 38 of those. And that's a lot for those days. Then they moved on to the Ferranti Mercury, which again was a version of one of the machines they got at Manchester. And that one used solid-state diodes, so they reduced the number of valves. It was actually a version of the Mark I. You can see that had 4,200 valves. The Mercury only had 2,000 valves. And then they actually had used core for RAM, because core was coming out at that point, and they had added floating point. You see the weight went down a lot, right, from 5 tons to 1.3 tons. And again, they sold quite a few of those, and they sold the very first machine that went into CERN in Switzerland. Then they came out with a line of machines called the Ferranti Argus, which were transistorized machines, and there was a whole range, and they all varied in architecture. And they were very different, because they were much more smaller and for military and industrial kind. And then they did the Ferranti Atlas, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then they came up with this thing called the Ferranti Packard 6000, which became the ICL 1900, so it's quite an important machine. But they actually got that from their Canadian subsidiary, Ferranti Packard, and picked it up. And they didn't sell many of them, but when it became the ICL 1900, it sold very well. And then in 1963, Ferranti's data processing organization got merged into ICT and then became ICL, and they kept the Ferranti Argus for themselves. So here's a few Ferranti pictures. There's the Ferranti Mark I on the top left, and there's the Ferranti Pegasus on the bottom left, and in the middle there's an advert for Ferranti Pegasus. So it's a very nice looking machine, and they did have one in the Science Museum for many years until it stopped working, and then they probably got it in storage now. And in the top right, that's actually the first Ferranti Mercury that went into CERN. That's CERN's first computer there. And in the bottom right, that's the Ferranti Packard 6000, which later went on to be the basis of the ICL 1900. This is interesting too. This is a programming card from the Pegasus, which kind of looks familiar, right? I mean, it sort of looks like some sort of programming card from an 8-bit micro or something. So it's kind of interesting how similar that is. I think I was quite surprised to find that. This is what the Argus range looked like. So it was interesting. I think what's interesting about the Argus is this is the point where they're not just building a computer, they're building a computer for a specific purpose, right? In the early days, it was like, yeah, let's just build a computer and see if we can build one at all work. But at this point, they were starting to think about, yeah, how can you differentiate these computers and make them go into different things? And so they all had different workloads and technologies. And these were, as I say, these went into Ferranti computer systems, not ICL. So next is the Ferranti Atlas, which is a really important machine for Britain. This again was put together by the University of Manchester, Ferranti, and Bletchley as well. And it was based on this Muse machine that Kilburn built in Manchester. And there was only 3 of them built. But it was really Britain's first and only supercomputer, right? It did a fantastic 1 MIPS, which in those days was tremendous. It used germanium transistors, no valves, and it had core memory, and it was pipeline. And the other interesting thing about it was probably the first machine with virtual memory and paging. Of course, in those days it was paging out to a drum, so it probably wasn't that fast, but it was a big improvement on given the cost of memory in those days. And it was so important they actually built its own laboratory for one of them. They built its own building in Chiltern that they used for, I think, nuclear energy research. And then they actually came out with a Titan II, which they put 2 of them into Cambridge and 1 into the Atomic Weapons Research Establishment in Aldermaston, nuclear weapons research. And it was a 48-bit machine, and they say that when it was switched on, it doubled the computer power in the UK overnight. Right, just the first one when it came on. So it was that important, and they ran for a long time. Here's a couple of pictures. The Atlas, the top right, and there's a view of the console, and that's the Atlas computer laboratory children there. I think it's kind of nice to see the guy with the beer and sandwiches on the left there, and tucking in on the legs, looking at the computer. See something. Okay, so EMI, you probably heard of EMI and thought, hey, it's a music company, right? It produces CDs and stuff, but it actually did all sorts of things. They made record players, music equipment, radios, all sorts of things. So they were quite involved. And so they wanted to get in the computer business as well, and they developed this machine called the EMI Electronic Business Machine, which is their first machine, valve and drum based. That was actually somewhat based on the Pilat ACE. There's not much information about it. But then in 1958, they went for transistors, and they actually built the first all-transistor computer that was sold in the UK, commercially sold. I think there was maybe another one that was made but not sold commercially by somebody, maybe Manchester. It was a 36-bit machine, 4 kilobytes of Ferrite core RAM, and they sold 24 of them at £200,000 each, which in those days was a lot of money, and that's not bad, actually. The interesting thing is the design was actually led by Godfrey Hounsfield. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he actually went on to develop the first CAT scanner. What happened is EMI, after they did this machine and the next machine, which was funded by the National Research Development Council, they decided they didn't really want to be in the computer business. And so they switched gears, and at that point the other interesting thing was, about 1961 or so, was the Beatles were very big, right? So EMI were actually doing quite well as a company. They had lots of money. And so they decided to give Godfrey Hounsfield, he wanted to work on a few things, and they said, go ahead. And he decided to work on the first CAT scanner, which he invented in 1960, between 1968 and 1975. The first CAT scanner came out. And I remember when the first CAT scanners came out, they were called EMI scanners, or EMI scanners, right? And the name has changed because they don't make them anymore. And Sir Godfrey Hounsfield won the Nobel Prize in Medicine for that in 1979. Let's see where I am. Okay. So somewhat the Beatles funded the development of the CAT scanner, which is computer-aided tomography. So here's a picture of the EMI-DEC, which is the first transistor computer, and there's a picture of Godfrey Hounsfield with the EMI scanner. So a few other computers in the early days, Elliott brothers were quite important. They had a whole range of machines. They produced a whole bunch of machines, and they eventually, they produced some valve machines, and they produced some transistorized machines, and they produced the 90-something series, which eventually got folded into GDC computers. We'll see that later. There was the English Electric Company. They produced the Deuce, which was a version of the Pilat ACE, and then they started to pick up some versions of machines that were produced in the States from RCA and sell those. The KDF-9, I think, was one of their own. And they also inherited the Leo as well when Alliance decided they didn't want to be in the computer business anymore. STC is an interesting one because STC is not really a computer company, they're a telephone company. And they were the kind of the other half of AT&T for the British Post Office. They were the guys who actually built things, right? The British Post Office was a telephone company, but they didn't build stuff. But Standard and Telephone Cables used to build all the equipment. And then they decided they wanted to get into the computer business, and so they licensed the Dutch design, and then they produced this thing called the Stantec Zebra, which was sold quite well in Britain for a while. I don't know how many they sold. And then, of course, there's International Computers and Tabulators, which is kind of a holding company that some of these companies or other companies were all folded into, and that was an intermediate step to becoming ICL. The other thing we should mention here is Computer Technology Ltd, which was a company that came out in the mid-60s, and it produced one of the few mini-computers that was produced in Britain called the Modular 1. And that was a 16-bit ECL machine, memory mapped I/O, segmented memory. It was very well thought of, and it was designed by a guy called Ian Barron, who had actually worked on the Elliott 803, and later he worked on INMOS, the transmuter. So here's a few pictures of some of these other machines. There's the Elliott 401, which is one of their early valve-based machines. That one is actually in the Science Museum of London. And the bottom left is an Elliott 905. That one's in the National Museum of Computing. And here's a few of the English Electric designs up there as well. That's the KDF9, which I think was their own homegrown design. There's an ad for the Stantec Zebra, which is STC's machine that they licensed from the Dutch designer. And there's a picture of the CTL Modular 1, which I think sold okay, but they had some problems with. It was a very modular machine and customized, so they found that every customer wanted a different kind of one, and that kind of killed the business. And there's a picture of Ian Barron later in his transputer days, holding up a transputer there. So now we get on to some of the things in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, which was this kind of different switch. We're going to cover some of the first machines, Sinclair and Acorn, Amstrad, some of the ones that also ran that you may not have heard of, ICL, Inmos, and some other things. So this sigmoid curve, I put that in there, so sort of it illustrates what happened, right? Things started off slow, then they took off, and then they faded out. But in reality, they were like multiple sigmoids overlapping each other. And the other thing I wanted to put up here is a couple of the magazines that we had sort of to keep us company in those days, which was Personal Computer World and Practical Computing, and they were really fun to have around. They were full of new stuff that was coming out every week, and it was quite something. The other thing I should mention is that although I'm really talking about English computers here, British computers, there were a lot of American computers in there too. Of course, we had the Commodore PET, TRS-80. Not a lot of them because they were very expensive. And some Apple IIs, but they mainly went into business. So in the early days, we did sort of few American imports, but not much. But later on, the VIC-20 came in, the Commodore 64s were very popular, the Ataris, the Amigas. So, I'm not going to talk about those, but they were definitely there, and they definitely had a pretty major impact on the market. And the other thing is, when a US machine, certainly in the early days, when a US machine ended up in Britain, they used to basically just translate the dollar signs to pound signs, right? So if something was $200 in the States, it ended up being 200 pounds in the UK, which was like double the price at that time. And so they were pretty expensive, right? And in the UK in those days, it was not great economic times for Britain. People had a lot less disposable income. That really affected the kind of machines that were produced and the way the market worked. And there were also like power supply conversion costs and video conversion costs, which one of the things I noticed when going through this is there's like hardly any S100 systems made into Britain because it was just too expensive, right? People just didn't go that way at all. So we'll go through some of the first British computers here. So this one's maybe not so well known. This is called the Bywood Scrumpy, which probably takes the prize for the very first British home computer. And it was very primitive. It was really just sort of an evaluation board. And it was based on the SCMP microprocessor from National Semiconductor, which is why the Scrumpy name, I think, was sort of an amalgamation of SCMP. And Scrumpy is also a kind of cider, which is why there's some little country bumpkins in the advert there, right? Sweeping the cider. And it was a very simple board. It had like toggle switches, LEDs, 256 bytes of RAM, but you could play with it. And it probably didn't sell many, probably a few hundreds, maybe 1,000 if they were lucky. But that probably takes the prize for the very first home computer. The NASCOM 1 was more important, and this was a single board machine. And when I say single board, it was a board, right? That's what you got. But you did get a keyboard with it, which they picked up from some terminals. They were repurposing terminal keyboards. And the company was actually like a component supplier, and they built this to find a market for their components, right? It was a single board kit form, Z80, 2 megahertz, 2K static RAM, and no basic. You just had a machine code thing, and that was it. It had a little output to a TV display, and it was about, well, as I said, 197 pounds 50, which is about $400 then. It's about $1,500 today, right, for that. And this is really kind of, I look at this as being like the equivalent of the Apple I for the UK. Right? This is it. Although they did sell a lot more than Apple I. They sold, well, it says they sold about 12,000 units, but I think that actually covers the NASCOM 2 as well, which we'll come on to in a minute. Okay, so this is Sinclair's first machine, and at that point he was going through some changes in his companies, which he did quite frequently actually. We'll come on to that later. But he came up with this little kit called the MK14. Which again, he was trying to do his own thing, and then he was buying all these chips from National Semiconductor, so they said, well, why don't you just use our design? So it's basically a National Semiconductor evaluation board design, which they said you can use for free, and he picked it up and he started selling it. And again, it was an SCMP-based board, and They sold quite a lot of them. I've heard something like 15,000 kits, which is quite a lot for a very primitive machine. But I think he actually had like, a segmented LEDs display back there, and he had his little keyboard, so it's a definite improvement on the Scrumpy. It was called the MK14. That doesn't mean Mark 14. That means Microcomputer Kit 14, because there's actually 14 chips on the board. So this is Acorn's first machine, which is a little bit less well known. It's called the Acorn System 1. So Acorn, it's got a 6502. It's built on what's called a Eurocard format. That's this little connector down here. It's called the Eurocard connector. It was designed. It has 1K RAM. It has the CUTS tape interface, and it was designed by Sophie Wilson, who we'll talk about later. And they also had like the System 2, 3, 4, and 5, which was designed to go into Eurocard racks. So it was an expandable system. They came up with other boards that they kept going with this for a while before they moved on to sort of. It was mainly sold for scientific and industrial applications. It really wasn't targeted for the hobbyists, so it wasn't that well known. And I don't know how many they sold. The NASCOM 2, this was kind of a follow-on from the NASCOM 1. It had a bigger board, same separate keyboard, Z82 megs or 4 meg switchable, 8K of VRAM this time, and an 8K Microsoft Basic. It had 69 by 48 character mono TV display. It had a tape interface. And again, it was about £225 or $295 there, but that was with the full memory board. It would pay about $1,400 today, so it's quite a pricey system for its time. The UK 101. Now this was interesting too, because this is a 6502 base board, 1 megahertz, 4K static RAM, 8K Microsoft Basic. But this was a UK version of the Ohio Scientific Superboard 2, which was sold over here. So it's an interesting exercise in cost comparison, because the Superboard 2 sold for $279 assembled in the States, and it was sold for £240 in the UK, which is almost the same dollar to pound conversions, which would have been about $500 then. It's about $1,500 today. And about 5,000 of these kits were sold, but it was quite a popular machine. So next we come to the Microtan 65, which is sort of similar to the Acorn System 1, but it was a little bit more targeted for the hobbyists. It was again a 6502 based machine. It was running at 750 kilohertz, which was a weird number, but it was designed, they played some tricks with the video circuitry, so they had to pick their clocking frequency very carefully to get the video stuff to work. And they only had 1K on this, but it was one of these expandable systems, again, a Eurocard connector on it, and you could buy other boards to kind of improve it and expand it. It was a pretty popular system, actually. They sold about 10,000 units on that one, apparently. So next we come to the Sinclair ZX80, which really sort of lit the fuse under the home computer market in the UK. This again was a Z80 at 3.25 megahertz, 1K RAM, and it's had their own Sinclair Basic and a mono display. This was a very interesting thing, because it had a case. It was the first one we'd seen with an actual case, and the price was ridiculous, right? It was £79, which is way cheaper than anything else on the market, about half the price. But I had to laugh at this advert, because I remember this advert actually coming out back in the day, and we were very excited. And we looked at it, and if you look at the size of the computer relative to the TV and the tape deck, right? It looks like it's about this big, and yet it's a tiny little thing. When you actually see it, it's quite a shock. And again, well, we'll get on to Sinclair a little bit later. And this is after Acorn's response. They saw what Sinclair had done, and they were in the same town as Sinclair, so they had pretty good communications with them. And this is a very nicely designed machine, I think. It was designed by a guy called Allan Boothroyd, who also designed the BBC Micro, the Electron, and then he's designed other Acorn computers. This is a 6502 machine. It has 2 kilobytes of memory. It has CUTS. It has a color display, so it has some graphics modes where you can actually display color. It has Acorn Basic, which is the first BASIC written by Sophie Wilson, and it has I think it has an Ethernet connector as well. And we'll come into maybe why that is. And that was sort of based on the Acorn System 3, in fact, which was those earlier boards that they made. And I don't know how many they've sold of those, but it was quite a popular machine. Okay. So next, Clive Sinclair, let's talk about him a little bit. we used to know him as Uncle Clive, right? Because he was always up to something. He was a great guy to have around at that time. In 1961, he formed Sinclair Radionics, and he used to sell all sorts of things. We'll show a few of those in a minute. But he always used to come up with these exciting little products. In 1977, he sold the MK14, which was his first thing, because Sinclair Radionics actually was in the process of going bust in 1977, so he spun out this other little company called Science at Cambridge to produce the MK14, and sent Chris Curry over there to manage it. And then he formed a new company in 1980 called Sinclair Research to build the ZX80, and then he came up with the ZX81. In 82 came the Spectrum, and in 1983 he got a 9 to it, so then he was certified. In 1984 he produced the QL, we'll talk about this more later, and which was known as the ZX83 during development. And then he produced in 1984 the QL, which again wasn't a great success. And so his business went haywire again in those days, and then he was taken over by Amstrad in 1986, who continued to sell some of those machines. And then he was back again in 1987 with another computer called, his company then was called Cambridge Computer, and he produced the Z88. So we'll talk about all those machines in a minute. So the thing I can say about Clive Sinclair was he was great to have around because he was capable of these high technology-driven products, but he was absolutely notorious for product delays and flaky products and high return rates, right? So, some of them, like Spectrums, apparently like 40% of them were returned because they just didn't work. But he always offered a lot of features for very low prices, so you sort of kind of tolerated it. And they even got to the point where they used to talk about Sinclair time, which was like, the time you would have to wait to get your thing that you'd ordered, and it was like one Sinclair day is like 6 real days. That's how long you have to wait for stuff to come. So these are some of the products. I don't know how many of those you know over here in the States, but he was into calculators. That was his first calculator, top left. He produced this thing called a black watch. It was the first LED watch in the world. These are the Sinclair Radionics products before the computers. And the Sinclair black watch used to kind of fry if you took it on a nylon carpet, so that wasn't too successful. And then he had the Sovereign calculator, the first programmable calculators in Britain on the right, which was very good, and there's some very good articles on the web about how he managed to eke out this programmability. It wasn't the most accurate of calculators, though. And then he had this obsession with small TVs, and he produced this Sinclair Microvision, which one of the things that bankrupted Sinclair Radionics. Little tiny radios, and then it's most famous for his C5 electronic vehicle, which would be a colossal failure. So anyway, the ZX81 he came out with in 1981, which again, lit the fire under this real market. It was a slightly improved ZX80. It was cost reduced. He got it down to 4 chips by just the microprocessor, RAM, ROM, and he used the uncommitted logic array, which is an early version of gate array from Ferranti. And he managed to shave £30 off the price of the ZX80, so what had been a really good value before was even better. And obviously the Ferranti ULA was used to reduce the chip count, but they also thought that by putting the code, the logic into the ULA, they would have some IP protection, that people wouldn't copy the machine so easily. And this was actually, they sold 1.5 million of these, so this really was the point where the market started to take off. And they also sold over here, as you probably know, is the Timex Sinclair, because Timex is one of the manufacturers for this machine in England, and they obviously developed a relationship there and sold. And the other thing was this was only sold with 1 kilobyte memory, so it also fired up a big secondary market for memory modules. So people used to sell 16K memory modules. Sinclair sold them, and lots of little third-party companies kicked off selling memory modules as well for it. Then we get to the Spectrum, which again was a very successful machine. And it was named to emphasize the color. The ZX80 and 81 were just monochrome machines, but they went, this was only a year later, right? And they went to color with the ZX Spectrum. It was running slightly faster Z80. This thing came with 16K of memory runoff, so it was a massive improvement. They had an improved BASIC, an 8K Sinclair BASIC, and they sold 5 million units of this all told over the lifetime of the product, which is pretty tremendous for an English machine. And it was one of the most cloned machines out. They used official clones, unofficial clones, even with the ULA. So having the ULA didn't really protect them much against cloning. So next, Sinclair goes on in 1984 to produce the Sinclair QL, which stood for Quantum Leap, which again was a very original machine for its time compared to some of the other things that were going on. It had a Motorola 68008, which was probably a bad decision because it kind of killed the performance of the thing, running at 7.5 megahertz. It had 128K, And he had these weird little things called micro drives, right, which everybody else was using floppies, but he decided to do his own thing with the drives. So they had these little continuous loop drives that were sort of plugged in here. And of course, they never caught on, so he was kind of putting himself in a little box there to do this here. It had a color display, and as I say, the performance was not as good as it should have been because he chose to have a 8-bit buzz version of the 68008 to save money, and that sort of killed his performance compared to some of the other things that were coming down the pipe. And he was, again, I think he was a bit muddled as to where he was targeting this. I think he was trying to position this as some sort of opponent to the IBM PC, which, you know, it's not quite there. It's kind of a home machine, but it's not really a business machine, so I think he was a bit confused on that one. It had Sinclair QDOS in the ROM, and it offered a complete Office suite by a company called Scion, which we'll talk about later. And it was very, very late on delivery. You know, he promised it, and it was so late they took to calling it the quite late. The QL stood for quite late. And they only sold 150,000 of this, and it was not very successful. As I said, the PC came out, IBM PC came out in like 1981, so they knew about it. But it started to hit the market in Britain in like 1982, 83, right? It always takes a few years for things to get over here. And it was, as soon as Amstrad took over, in fact, this was one of the things that tanked Sinclair research. Was this, you know, this box didn't do as well as he'd hoped. And also, he was actually trying to produce another kind of flat TV version as well, which is a complete flop. So, you know, he basically was nearly bankrupt, and then Amstrad swooped in, took him over, and in fact, they made money because they sold off the stock QLs at rock bottom price and made their money back. And in fact, the QL did have a little bit of a life after this, because they sold off all the motherboards to a company called CST. They produced the CST Thor, and also there was a lot of integration of voice and data at those days. So British Telecom took this machine and produced the ICL1 per desk, the British Telecom Tonto and ICL1 per desk. And also it's kind of famous because Linus Torvalds cut his teeth on one of these things. Okay, so this is Sinclair's last machine called the Sinclair, the Cambridge Computers Z88, because he had to change the name of his company again. And this is quite a well thought of machine. It's like a little portable machine, and a Z80 CMOS version, so low power. It had 32K memory, had little memory card slots. It worked on regular batteries, and it used VCF Basic. And the other notable thing is it used a thing called a Super Twist LCD display, which was brand new then. And it was the first machine to do that. And that kind of caused him some troubles because that was licensed by the Ministry of Defence in Britain. So nobody was quite sure if they were going to come back and sue him for patents or not, but in the end they didn't. It wasn't cheap, but it was a quite successful machine, and I think it's one of Sinclair's more sturdy and better machines. So now a little interlude to talk about this. What happened in 1979 is this documentary came out called The book came out first, called The Mighty Micro by Chris Evans. And so they liked the book, so ITV made a TV series of it. And it was incredibly influential because, you know, people were sort of woken up to the potential of the microprocessor and what it could do. And there was even questions asked in Parliament about, you know, what's Britain doing about this? And that somewhat prompted the BBC to kick up their computer literacy project, which they announced in 1981. And they, so, you know, what they wanted to do was a computer literacy program to kind of educate people on what computers were. And of course, they needed a computer to do that. So that's one of the things that kicked off the whole BBC Micro project. So now let's switch gears to talk about Acorn. So Acorn was actually founded in 1978. It wasn't Acorn to start with, but it became Acorn really quite rapidly by Herman Howells and Chris Curry. Chris Curry had actually worked for Sinclair, but he left to join Acorn. And not so well known is a guy called Andy Hocker who worked for Cambridge on he developed networking technologies, a very famous one called Cambridge Ring. And he joined them as well. So we've heard about the Acorn System 1, 2, the Atom. So then they came out with the BBC Micro in 81, then the Electron in 83 and started their own development. They produced a thing called Cambridge Workstation. We'll go over these machines a little bit. So here's the BBC Micro that was produced initially for the BBC, and then the BBC weren't going to pay for one to be in every school, but the Department of Trade and Industry said we need to have one in every school. So yeah, I've actually got a ton of material to go through, so I'm going to skip a little bit faster. So this is the BBC Micro, and it was famous. It had these things called second processors. It was designed to be a dual processor machine out there, and they refreshed it with the BBC Master halfway through. The Acorn Electron, this is the machine that basically tanked Acorn because they had problems they delayed it. They played some strange. It was basically a cost-reduced BBC Micro, and because of that, they kind of squeezed the cost down a little bit too much and trying to be a bit too ambitious, I think. That thing in the middle with the steel cap on is the ULA, the Ferranti ULA, that caused massive delays, and so they couldn't get the electron out in time, and so they had 250,000 unsold Acorns that they couldn't get rid of, and that caused a lot of financial troubles for the company. Later on, they came out in 1987 with the Acorn Archimedes, which was the first RISC machine with an Acorn machine with an ARM chip in it. And there was a whole range of those, but the 440, they all had the same case and all came down pretty much in the same days. Then they came out in 1989 with the Archimedes A3000, which was the last BBC branded micro. And then in these all had ARM chips in. They all had the ARM3 or ARM2 chip in. Actually, no, the 1989 one had an ARM chip in, but the A3010, 3010 is most famous for being the first ARM system on chip in there. They came out with the Cambridge Workstation, which is basically a BBC Micro with a National Semiconductor NS32016 coprocessor in there. Wasn't very successful. They produced a laptop in 1992, which had an ARM chip in it, so that's the first RISC laptop. They came out with the Acorn Pocketbook, which was a version of the Scion Series 3 machine. And then later they had another range of PCs called the Acorn RISC PCs, which had this strange slice concept that you could sort of add on different slices and sort of stack the machine up. And then in 1998, this is their last possible machine that was never actually shipped, called the Acorn Phoebe, or RISC PC2, which again had a RISC chip in it. And they were going to sell this, but they decided that's it for us, we're done with home computers. And the strange thing was they had all these cases produced, so they actually sold the cases, but not the computers. So there are cases floating around without computers in them. So quick aside to how ARM got started. They spun out the ARM company from Acorn. They decided to design this ARM chip. It was designed by Steve Ferber with the floor plan, Sophie Wilson who did the instruction set architecture. They were trying to find a follower for the 6502, but they weren't happy with what was going on. They visited the Western Design Center in Phoenix and said, well, this guy is designing this processor in his kitchen, so we should be able to do it too. They tried to get the 8286 from Intel, but Intel wouldn't cooperate, so they said, okay, we do our own. They had a very small design team, which is why they went for the RISC thing. It was just possible to design it. And when they produced the ARM1, it was extremely low power consumption, which was kind of strange because they weren't really designing for that, right? It wasn't their goal, this was a desktop processor. But that became very important. In 1990, they put it in their own machines initially. And in 1990, Apple came calling with the Apple Newton, and needed a low-cost, low-power processor that was going to be speedy enough for the Newton. And of course, we know the Newton wasn't a great success, but that got them in the door there. And the thing that really kicked them off was Nokia. In 1997, came along and said, well, we would like the same processor, it has to be super low power. But the one thing they said, which was really critical, is they said, we don't want to buy it from you, we want to buy it from Texas Instruments. So that's the thing that kicked off the ARM licensing model. They were forced to license it to TI, so TI could produce it. And that's really one of the keys to the success of ARM, is they license it to everybody. And of course, in 2007, the iPhone came along. And the current estimate is there's 100 billion ARM cores out there. And I suspect there's probably, 100 or so ARM cores in front of me right now, sitting in your pockets, right? So, amazing thing. And there's a few pictures of the ARM developers. That's Sophie Wilson on the top right, Steve Ferber on the top left. And this in the bottom right is kind of interesting because that's the actual handwritten floor plan of the first ARM machine that's in the Computer Museum in Cambridge. I should mention this, which is Micro Men. This is a documentary about Sinclair and Chris Curry and what happened and how they got into a fight in the pub. That's kind of a fun thing to watch if you want to know more about the history of these two and what happened. Amstrad, maybe not so well known, but Amstrad was a consumer electronics guy, and he was more of a businessman, not a technology guy. And he really knew how to produce, he really consumerized the PC in Britain. He came up with the CPC 464, which is a kind of a boring machine, but it was very good, and he got it out on time, and it was a good price. And he had Ferranti ULA problems, but he just said, forget it, I'll switch. And he went to LSI Logic, and they could produce it, so he just kept moving until he got what he wanted. And then he came out with a word processor, which was a really clever idea. So he said, what do people want? They want a word processor. So he came up with a very simple word processor, and he sold 8 million of them. So he was really good at figuring out what people wanted. And in 1986, he acquired Sinclair Research, and he kept the Spectrum name and produced a few new Spectrums. And he also produced some other weird machines. And then he went on to produce IBM compatibles, but there were some portables too, which was kind of strange. And he was knighted in 2000, and he was actually the host of the British Apprentice at one point. And now he's Lord Allan. So there he is, Allan Michael Sugar. That's Allan Michael Sugar stands for his company, Allan Michael Sugar Trading, Amstrad. There's the CPC 464, bottom left, the word processor in the middle. One of the weird machines up in the top right, a Sinclair branded MS-DOS machine, which wasn't very successful. And these are his portable PCs down here. So now we move on to some others. Research machines. They were very popular in schools and universities because they had a subsidy from the government. They were one of the first machines. And then there was another company called Rare Black Box. Clearly they sold in black boxes. And they were interesting because they started off making 8085 CPM machines and migrated into making 8088 MS-DOS machines. And they eventually were rebadged by ICL. And these both look like S100 machines, right? But they're not S100 machines at all. Okay, there's a few other interesting ones. The fastest microcomputer in the universe, the Jupiter Ace. This is a very obscure machine. They only sold 5,000 or so of them. But the reason they claim that is because it used fourths, not basic. So it's a bit interesting, right? It has Z18 and 1K around. It was designed by some of the same guys that designed the ZX81, which is why the same thing. The Dragon was produced by a Welsh toy company initially. Because they had the mechanism to mold plastic cases. So they said, well, why don't we not make computers? So it's got a great case. And it's actually got a 6809, and it's somewhat compatible with the Tandy color computer. They use the same reference design, so some of the tapes will work on that. The New Brain is the machine that's famous for being could have been the BBC Micro machine, right? It was intended to be the BBC Micro, but it took too long to get it out, and it changed companies several times. It was initially with a company called New Brain, and then it changed to Grundy, and they just couldn't get it on time. But when it finally came out, it was quite a well thought of machine. Oric was actually Tangerine, the guys who built that Micro 1065. They did these. This was their follow-on. They did the Oric 1 and the Oric Atlas, which is quite well thought of machines, quite nicely. They did quite well in Europe. The Velotech is an interesting machine. That kind of came out in 1982. That's a bit obscure. Not many people know about that. It had a nice case, aluminium case, and it was good specs. Very well thought of machine, but they came out a bit late. And what they were trying to do is they were trying to get the Russian schools contract for the Russian schools micro. And so they spent a lot of money, Russianizing the machine, painting it red, putting Cyrillic keyboards on it, and then they didn't get it. And so then that was the end of the company. There was another company called Apricot that made CBM machines initially, and then went on to make MS-DOS compatible machines. The Computers Ltd, 1983, came out, again a bit late, nice specs. And then the Enterprise, which again was a good machine, but just a bit late, I think. That was probably the last British home computer. There was a company called Scion that came out. It was founded by a guy called David Potter. They made these little handheld things, kind of a forerunner to Palm. They made the Scion Organizer. The Scion Series 3 was very well thought of. And then they made the Series 5, which wasn't. Ferranti Semiconductor. They made the ULAs, and they had a lot of the ULA market in the 1980s, a 40% market share. And they made the ULAs for a lot of these companies. They also produced a microprocessor, the F100L, which was claimed to be Europe's first 16-bit microprocessor. It was a bipolar one, but it used to get pretty hot. It was radiation hot, so it used to use it for some spacecraft activities. ICL, I mentioned before, this was kind of a thing that was forced by the British government to cobble together all the early computer companies into one big company that kind of take on IBM. And they had some less than stellar machines. They had the 1900, which was a follow-on from, I think, that English electric machine. No, that was a France machine. And then they had the ICL 2900, which is a follow-on, which is a very complex machine. But that was kind of the mainstay. I think a lot of British government organizations used to buy it because they were kind of forced to, more or less. And then they rebadged the ICL Perk, which is nice, because there was a lot of demand from the British scientific community. And then the ICL Series 39 was a follow-on, and they were gradually defending more and more on Fujitsu for their technology, and so eventually they were acquired. Here's a few pictures of ICL 2900s, ICL Perks, and we used to call it Big Orange, because it was orange, not blue. GEC Computers and Prestel. I wish I had more time to talk about Prestel. It was like a video tech system. And GC used to make a bunch of computers that were like the back end for Prestel. These were minis, they weren't that well, they did quite well in X25 switches, things like that. Not many of them around. Okay, Inmos, you may have heard of them. This was a chip company founded to produce the transputer. The idea was to produce a memory company in the States, which would make money, and that would fund the transputer operations in the UK. Of course, the Japanese flooded the market with cheap RAMs, and so the idea of making money on RAMs fell to pieces. The company ran out of money, but they did produce some very nice technology and parallel processing technology, which it was pretty influential in the day, and eventually they got sold off to SGS. Sinclair back again. A few interesting things with Sinclair. He actually had a few other companies on the go at the end of '85. One, he was doing wafer scale integration, believe it or not, and he was trying to produce this wafer stack of like solid state disks, and he was planning to do transputer arrays on the wafer. And he even started this weird project called the PGC 7000, which was a QO replacement. And he was going to use transputers to emulate x86s. And interestingly enough, he got this guy called Chris Shelton involved, who's the NASCOM 1 designer. So Tim Berners-Lee, somewhere in here, invents the Wild Wild Web. We're at CERN. And that's the machine he invented, worked on the next machine in CERN. Pursley Park, this is very interesting. This is a research and development place in England. South of England. It's developed some very interesting stuff. The SCAMP, which was IBM's first microprogram machine, it was really a prototype. And then they had responsibility for the IBM 36040 that they designed. They worked on the IBM Future Systems project. They're most famous for KICS, the Customer Information Control System, and for inventing the swing arm on the disk drive, which is how the disk drive works today. Here's a few of the things from Pursley Park. It's a museum you can visit. So a few modern things, XMOS. I'm going to skip over those for a second, but DeepMind is one of the British success stories in London, doing artificial intelligence. They were acquired by Google, they do AlphaGo. The Raspberry Pi you've probably heard of, this ARM processor, Linux, 20 million plus of those sold. So that's actually like the most successful British computer ever. The BBC Microbit, which is like a little tiny computer, was basically intended, it was like a forum from the BBC Micro, anyways, to give one free to every school kid in Britain. Again, it has an ARM processor, and so this actually got some downstairs in the gift shop. So XMOS is a very interesting company. This is kind of what came out with the legacy of the transputer, and it's a little microcontroller, 8 or 16-bit, 32-bit cores, very similar to the transputer. They do a lot of work in the voice and DSP, far field beamforming kind of stuff. The Spinnaker project is interesting. This is a project, a neuromorphic computing platform for the human brain project. And it's Steve Ferber's project at the University of Manchester. And he's got 1 million ARM cores on this thing. And he's developed a custom chip with 18 ARM cores and mandatory. Here's some of the pictures of that. Just past 1 million ARM cores. So I think they say that can simulate 1 billion neurons, which is about a mouse's brain. So they're on the way. This is the microbit, which you can actually see downstairs in the gift shop. This is what happened to ARM, of course. They were taken over by the biggest takeover in British history, 32 billion by SoftBank. And then, just before, this is my last slide, so these are some interesting places to see computers in the UK. The Science Museum is actually very good. It's not a computer museum, but they have a whole second floor full of old computer stuff, and it's all good, but nothing's working, and you can see the Babbage difference engineering. The National Museum of Computing at Bletchley Park, they're actually two separate museums, so if you go there, leave enough time to see both. They have some very good early computers, some of them are working, and they have the Colossus replica. The Centre for Computing History in Cambridge, that's the home of Acorn and ARM, and Sinclair, and it's good for home computers. IBM Pursley Park is actually open, they have a museum, but it's kind of by arrangement only. They have the Science and Industry Museum in Manchester, there's a Manchester Baby working replica. The ones with question marks are ones I haven't been to personally, so I can't vouch for them, but I'll get there someday. The computer sheds in York are like this collection of incredible stuff that one guy has collected and stored in sheds. It's not really a museum, but you can go and visit it by arrangement. And then there's the History Science Museum in Oxford, which doesn't have much related to computing, a few little old bits of the Babbage difference engine, and 8 other places of original notes. But it's an interesting museum, nevertheless. Okay, so a couple of things. If you don't know about these, of course, Wikipedia is excellent for the definitive source of this. there's a site called Register, which has some great, really in-depth stories about some of this early computing stuff. Nosha.net is where all the ads come from, but they don't just have the ads, they have a really good explanation of what happened at that time. And of course, there's some great things on YouTube, some old videos of these early British computers and things like that. And a couple of good books, Early British Computers by this guy called Simon Larrington, which is he's like a historian of British computers in Britain. And there's a book on the video as well. Okay, so that's it for me. Thank you very much. And sorry.